My grandfather served in Vietnam too. Do you know anyone here?
Yes, someone very special to me.
Old veteran brings flowers every Sunday. Then the town learns the heartbreaking truth. For 15 years, 78-year-old Marine veteran Frank Sullivan had walked to Oakwood Cemetery every Sunday with a single white rose sitting by a grave marked Unknown Soldier. The townspeople thought he was honoring a fallen comrade. But when Frank collapsed at the graveside, the truth he'd hidden would break their hearts. Oakwood Cemetery in Millfield, Pennsylvania, was a place where time seemed suspended between memory and eternity. Every Sunday, at precisely 10 a.m., Frank Sullivan would appear at the cemetery gates, his weathered Marine dress uniform pressed to perfection, despite his arthritis-gnarled hands. He carried a single white rose and walked with the measured pace of a man who had learned discipline in the crucible of war. His destination was always the same, a modest granite headstone in Section C that read simply, Unknown Soldier, Vietnam War, 1969. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his ritual, respecting the old Marine's dedication to honoring the fallen. Frank Sullivan had returned from Vietnam in 1970 as a different man than the eager 19-year-old who had enlisted 2 years earlier. The jungles of Southeast Asia had taken his youth, his innocence, and something deeper that he could never quite name. At 78, he lived alone in a small apartment above Murphy's hardware store, surviving on his military pension and the occasional odd job he could still manage with his aging body. The townspeople knew Frank as a quiet, dignified man who kept to himself, but would always tip his cap to neighbors and help elderly ladies with their groceries. His apartment was sparse but immaculate, decorated only with a few military commendations and a photograph of his Marine unit taken in Da Nang in 1969. What the town didn't know was that Frank carried a burden heavier than any combat pack he had shouldered in Vietnam. For 55 years, he had lived with a secret that had shaped every day of his civilian life, a promise made in the chaos of war that had become his sacred duty. The white roses he brought to the unknown soldier's grave weren't just tokens of respect. They were offerings of penance, love, and a grief so profound it had defined his entire existence. The residents of Millfield had developed their own theories about Frank's weekly pilgrimage. Some believed he was honoring his best friend who had died in combat. Others thought he was paying respects to his brother or son. The local newspaper had once tried to interview him about his service, but Frank had politely declined, saying only that some stories are too personal to share. Sarah Chin, who managed the flower shop where Frank bought his weekly rose, had tried to engage him in conversation over the years. "Same rose as always, Mr. Sullivan?" she would ask, hoping to learn more about the man behind the ritual. Frank would simply nod, pay exact change, and continue his solemn journey to the cemetery. Frank's Sunday routine never varied. He would wake at 6 a.m., shower and shave with military precision, and don his Marine dress uniform, the same one he had worn to his discharge ceremony in 1970. Every brass button was polished, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. At 9:30, he would walk the 6 blocks to Chen's Flowers, purchase a single white rose, and arrive at the cemetery exactly at 10 a.m. At the grave, Frank would stand at attention for exactly 1 minute, then place the rose at the base of the headstone. He would sit on the small bench he had donated to the cemetery 15 years earlier and spend the next hour in silent contemplation. Sometimes his lips would move as if he were having a conversation, but no sound emerged. Weather never deterred him. Through rain, snow, and the brutal Pennsylvania winters, Frank maintained his vigil. Cemetery groundskeeper Tom Bradley had offered to drive Frank on particularly harsh days, but the old Marine always declined. "A promise is a promise," Frank would say. "Weather doesn't change that." The only variation in Frank's routine came on Memorial Day, when he would bring 2 roses instead of 1. As Frank aged and his walk became more labored, the community's interest in his story intensified. Local teenagers, initially dismissive of the old guy with the flower, began to show respect for his dedication. Some would nod respectfully when they passed him on the street, sensing something sacred in his weekly journey. Pastor Michael Torres of St. Mary's Catholic Church had tried to reach out to Frank, inviting him to join the church's veteran support group. "We have other Vietnam veterans who might understand what you're carrying," Pastor Torres had suggested. But Frank had politely declined, explaining that his burden was his alone to bear. The mystery deepened when Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, who lived near the cemetery, mentioned that she sometimes heard Frank talking at the graveside. "It sounds like he's having a conversation," she told her bridge club, "like someone's talking back to him." Dr. Amanda Foster, a local psychiatrist who specialized in veteran PTSD, had observed Frank from a distance and recognized the signs of someone carrying profound survivor's guilt. She had seen it in many veterans: the need to honor the dead through ritual and sacrifice. The first sign that Frank's carefully maintained routine was breaking down came on a particularly cold February morning. Sarah Chen noticed that Frank's hands were shaking more than usual as he counted out change for his rose. His uniform, while still pressed, showed signs of wear that suggested he was struggling with the physical demands of maintaining his appearance. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah said gently, "are you feeling all right? You look tired." Frank paused, and for a moment Sarah thought he might finally open up. His eyes, usually focused and determined, seemed distant and filled with pain. "Some days are harder than others," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I made a promise. Promises don't have expiration dates." That Sunday, cemetery visitors noticed that Frank's hour-long vigil stretched to nearly 2 hours. Tom Bradley, the groundskeeper, found Frank still sitting on the bench as the sun began to set, staring at the unknown soldier's grave with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Mr. Sullivan," Tom approached carefully, "are you okay?" Frank looked up, his composure cracking for the first time in 15 years. "I should have told his story years ago," he said. "He deserves to have his story told." The breakthrough came when 12-year-old Danny Martinez, whose grandfather had served in Vietnam, approached Frank at the cemetery. Danny had been visiting his grandfather's grave and noticed the old Marine's weekly ritual. "My grandpa was in Vietnam too," Danny said, sitting beside Frank on the bench. "He told me stories about the war before he died. Did you know the soldier buried here?" Frank looked at the boy, seeing something in his earnest face that reminded him of another young person from long ago. "Son," Frank said slowly, "that's not just any unknown soldier. That's my boy." Danny's eyes widened. "Your son, not by blood," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But in every way that mattered. His name was Tommy Nguyen, and he was 17 years old when he died in my arms." The story began to pour out of Frank like water through a broken dam. Tommy Nguyen had been a South Vietnamese teenager who had served as an interpreter for Frank's unit. Orphaned by the war, Tommy had attached himself to the Marines, becoming their unofficial little brother and Frank's surrogate son. Tommy was the smartest kid I ever met, Frank told Danny, his eyes distant with memory. Spoke 4 languages, could fix any radio or engine, and had a smile that could light up the darkest bunker. The other Marines called him Little Professor because he was always reading books he'd found in abandoned buildings. Frank described how Tommy had saved their unit multiple times with his intelligence gathering and language skills. The teenager had been trying to earn enough money to bring his younger sister to America when the war ended. He had this dream, Frank continued, of going to college in America and becoming a doctor. He'd show me pictures he'd drawn of the house he wanted to buy for his sister, complete with a white picket fence and a dog. The tragedy had occurred during Frank's final patrol in Vietnam. Their convoy had been ambushed, and Tommy had been mortally wounded while trying to help evacuate injured Marines. He had died in Frank's arms, asking Frank to promise that he would tell Tommy's story and make sure he wasn't forgotten. I promised him he'd be remembered as a hero, Frank said. But when we got back to base, there was no record of Tommy. Officially, he never existed. Frank's voice grew bitter as he explained the bureaucratic nightmare that had followed Tommy's death. Because Tommy wasn't an official U.S. military member, his death wasn't recorded in American casualty reports. The South Vietnamese government had collapsed, and there was no one to claim his body or document his service. They were going to bury him in an unmarked grave, Frank said. Just another casualty of war that nobody wanted to acknowledge. I fought the system for months, but I was just a grunt. Nobody listened. Frank had used his own money to have Tommy's body shipped back to the United States, but without official documentation, Tommy couldn't be buried in a military cemetery with full honors. The best Frank could arrange was burial in Millfield's Oakwood Cemetery under the designation Unknown Soldier. I've been coming here every Sunday for 55 years, Frank told Danny. Every week I tell Tommy about what's happening in the world, about the America he dreamed of seeing. I bring him white roses because they were his favorite. He said they reminded him of hope. The weight of carrying this secret alone had nearly broken Frank, but he had never wavered in his promise to keep Tommy's memory alive. Danny Martinez couldn't keep Frank's story to himself. He told his mother, who told Pastor Torres, who shared it with the church's veteran support group. Within days, the story of Tommy Nguyen and Frank's 55-year vigil had spread throughout Millfield. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah Chen began donating Frank's weekly roses, refusing to accept payment. Tom Bradley started maintaining the area around Tommy's grave with special care, planting white rose bushes that would bloom each spring. Local historian Margaret Walsh began researching Tommy's story, using Frank's memories and military records to piece together the teenager's life and service. She discovered that Tommy had indeed saved multiple American lives and had been recommended for a Bronze Star that was never processed due to his unofficial status. The high school's history class adopted Tommy's grave as a project, researching the stories of other forgotten heroes from the Vietnam War. Students began joining Frank on his Sunday visits, listening to his stories about Tommy and learning about the human cost of war. Mr. Sullivan, one student said, "Tommy's story is finally being told. You kept your promise." But Frank's health was declining, and everyone could see that his decades-long vigil was taking its toll. The harsh winter of 2024 proved too much for Frank's aging body. His arthritis worsened, making it difficult to dress in his uniform, and his breathing became labored during the 6-block walk to the cemetery. On several Sundays, concerned neighbors found him resting on benches along his route, struggling to complete his journey. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's daughter and a local physician, approached Frank about his health concerns. "Mr. Sullivan, you're pushing yourself too hard. Your body needs rest." But Frank was adamant about maintaining his promise to Tommy. "I've never missed a Sunday in 55 years," he told Dr. Walsh. "I'm not starting now." The community rallied around Frank, with volunteers offering to drive him to the cemetery or even bring flowers on his behalf. But Frank refused all assistance, insisting that the promise was his to keep. "You don't understand," Frank explained to Pastor Torres during one of their conversations. "Tommy died believing that someone would remember him, that his sacrifice would matter. If I stop coming, if I break that promise, then he really will be forgotten." The physical toll was evident to everyone who saw Frank. His uniform hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his once steady hand shook as he placed each weekly rose. But his determination never wavered, even as his body began to fail him. On March 15, 2025, Frank began his usual Sunday routine, despite feeling weaker than ever. He had spent the previous night polishing his uniform buttons and preparing his rose, determined to honor his commitment to Tommy, regardless of his physical condition. Sarah Chen noticed Frank's labored breathing when he came for his rose. "Mr. Sullivan, maybe you should rest today. I'm sure Tommy would understand." Frank smiled weakly, but shook his head. "Tommy never got to rest when he was helping us. I won't rest now." The walk to the cemetery took Frank nearly an hour instead of his usual 20 minutes. Several neighbors offered assistance, but Frank politely declined each offer. Tom Bradley, the groundskeeper, watched nervously as Frank made his way slowly through the cemetery gates. At Tommy's grave, Frank stood at attention as always, but his salute was shaky and his breathing labored. He placed the white rose at the base of the headstone and sat heavily on his bench, looking more exhausted than anyone had ever seen him. "Tommy," Frank whispered, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery, "I don't know how many more Sundays I have left, son, but I want you to know that your story is finally being told. The whole town knows about you now. You're not forgotten anymore." Frank closed his eyes and leaned back against the bench, a peaceful expression crossing his weathered face. For the first time in 55 years, he felt like his burden was shared, that Tommy's memory would survive even if he couldn't continue his vigil. Tom Bradley found Frank an hour later, still sitting peacefully on the bench, having passed away quietly while keeping his final promise to Tommy. When Frank's apartment was cleaned out after his death, the community discovered the full extent of his devotion to Tommy's memory. His sparse living space contained dozens of journals documenting every Sunday visit, every conversation he'd had with Tommy's grave, and every significant event he'd shared with his surrogate son. The journals revealed the depth of Frank's love for the Vietnamese teenager who had become his family. Frank had written about Tommy's dreams, his fears, his hopes for his sister, and his courage in the face of war. He had documented Tommy's jokes, his questions about America, and his determination to help the Marines who had become his brothers. Most heartbreaking was Frank's final journal entry written the night before his death. Tommy, I think my time is coming soon, but I'm not afraid anymore. The people of Millfield know your story now. They understand what you sacrificed for us. You'll never be forgotten again. I kept my promise, son. I kept my promise. The journals also contained letters Frank had written to Tommy's sister, whom he had never been able to locate, and detailed plans for a proper memorial that would tell Tommy's story to future generations. Frank Sullivan's death sent shock waves through Millfield. The man who had quietly honored a forgotten hero for 55 years had become a hero himself, and the community was determined to ensure that both Frank's and Tommy's stories would be remembered. Pastor Torres organized a memorial service that filled St. Mary's Catholic Church beyond capacity. Veterans from across Pennsylvania came to honor Frank's dedication, and many shared their own stories of promises made to fallen comrades. Frank Sullivan showed us what true loyalty looks like, Pastor Torres said during the eulogy. For 55 years, he carried the memory of a young man who had no one else to remember him. In doing so, Frank became the father Tommy never had, and the guardian of a story that needed to be told. The service concluded with a procession to Oakwood Cemetery, where hundreds of people gathered around Tommy's grave. Each person placed a white rose on the headstone, creating a mountain of flowers that honored both the forgotten Vietnamese teenager and the Marine who had never forgotten him. Sarah Chen announced that she would continue providing weekly roses for Tommy's grave, ensuring that Frank's tradition would continue even in his absence. In the days following Frank's funeral, some community members questioned whether they were doing enough to honor his memory and Tommy's sacrifice. The weekly flowers were beautiful, but Frank's journals had revealed his dream of creating a proper memorial that would educate people about the forgotten heroes of war. Margaret Walsh, the local historian, took the lead in organizing a more permanent tribute. Frank spent 55 years telling Tommy's story to an empty grave, she told the town council. Now it's our turn to tell both of their stories to the world. The proposal for a memorial garden at the cemetery initially faced resistance due to cost and bureaucratic hurdles. Some questioned whether the town should spend money honoring a non-American soldier, not understanding the deeper meaning of Frank's devotion. But the community's determination to honor Frank's promise proved stronger than any obstacle. Fundraising efforts began immediately, with donations pouring in from across the country as Frank's story spread through social media and news outlets. The Tommy Nguyen Memorial Garden Project became a community-wide effort that brought together people from all walks of life. Veterans organizations provided expertise on military honors and protocol. Local businesses donated materials and labor. High school students researched and wrote the historical plaques that would tell Tommy's story. The centerpiece of the memorial was a bronze statue depicting Frank and Tommy together, the aging Marine and the young Vietnamese interpreter who had become his son. The statue was based on a photograph Frank had kept in his wallet for 55 years, showing him and Tommy sharing a meal in their bunker. Surrounding the statue were white rose gardens that would bloom each spring, ensuring that Tommy would always be surrounded by his favorite flowers. Benches were placed throughout the garden, inviting visitors to sit and reflect on the bonds that transcend nationality, race, and circumstance. The memorial also included a wall listing the names of other forgotten heroes from the Vietnam War. Interpreters' guides and local allies who had died helping American forces but had never received official recognition. The memorial dedication ceremony on Memorial Day 2025 drew thousands of visitors to Millfield. Vietnam veterans from across the country came to honor both Frank and Tommy, many sharing their own stories of local allies who had risked everything to help American forces. The ceremony began with a military honor guard presenting colors, followed by the reading of Tommy's story by Danny Martinez, the young boy who had first heard Frank's confession. Danny's voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd as he described Tommy's courage, his dreams, and his ultimate sacrifice. Tommy Nguyen was 17 years old when he died. Danny read from Frank's journals. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, of bringing his sister to America, of seeing the Statue of Liberty. He died protecting the Marines who had become his family, and for 55 years, one of those Marines made sure he was never forgotten. The emotional climax came when a surprise guest was introduced, Mrs. Lynn Nguyen Peterson, Tommy's younger sister who had been located through the efforts of Vietnamese-American organizations. Now 72 years old and living in California, she had traveled to Millfield to finally visit her brother's grave. Mrs. Nguyen Peterson's presence at the ceremony created a moment of profound healing that no one had anticipated. Through tears, she shared her own memories of Tommy, his intelligence, his protective nature, and his determination to create a better life for his family. For 60 years, I wondered what happened to my brother, she said through an interpreter. I knew he was helping American soldiers, but I never knew how he died or where he was buried. Today, I finally get to say goodbye. She placed a traditional Vietnamese incense offering at Tommy's grave alongside the white roses, bridging two cultures in a moment of shared grief and love. The sight of Tommy's sister finally reuniting with her brother even in death brought tears to every eye in the cemetery. Frank Sullivan kept his promise, Mrs. Nguyen Peterson said. He took care of my brother when I couldn't. He became the family Tommy needed. The ceremony concluded with the establishment of the Frank Sullivan-Tommy Nguyen Foundation, dedicated to supporting Vietnamese-American students pursuing careers in medicine, fulfilling Tommy's dream of becoming a doctor through the next generation. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was Danny Martinez, who announced his intention to study medicine and work with veteran communities. Mr. Sullivan and Tommy taught me that promises matter, Danny said. I promise to use my education to help others just like Tommy wanted to do. As the ceremony ended, visitors continued to place white roses on Tommy's grave, creating a tradition that would continue long after the formal memorial was complete. The unknown soldier's grave had become a place of pilgrimage, drawing people who wanted to honor not just Tommy and Frank, but all the forgotten heroes whose stories deserve to be told. The Tommy Nguyen Memorial Garden became a destination for visitors from around the world, drawing people who were moved by the story of Frank's 55-year vigil. The memorial was featured in national news outlets, documentaries, and military publications, spreading the story of loyalty and love that transcended cultural boundaries. The town of Millfield experienced an unexpected tourism boost as people came to visit the memorial and learn about Frank and Tommy's story. Local businesses reported increased visitors, and the town council voted to establish an annual Memorial Day celebration centered around the garden. Most importantly, The memorial sparked conversations about the forgotten allies who had helped American forces throughout various conflicts. Veterans organizations began researching and documenting similar stories, ensuring that other Tommy Nguyens would not be lost to history. Mrs. Nguyen Peterson decided to relocate to Millfield to be near her brother's grave, becoming an integral part of the community that had honored his memory. Her presence added authenticity and cultural depth to the memorial's mission. The Frank Sullivan-Tommy Nguyen Foundation grew into a significant scholarship program, helping dozens of Vietnamese-American students pursue medical careers. The foundation also supported research into the stories of other forgotten allies from the Vietnam War, leading to official recognition for many previously unknown heroes. Frank's journals were published as a book titled Letters to Tommy, with proceeds supporting the foundation. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that won several awards and further spread their story. The Memorial Garden inspired similar projects in other communities, creating a network of memorials honoring forgotten heroes from various conflicts. The concept of adopted graves, where community members commit to maintaining the memory of unknown or forgotten soldiers, spread to cemeteries across the country. Military training programs began, including Frank and Tommy's story as an example of the bonds that can form between American forces and local allies, emphasizing the importance of honoring those relationships even after conflicts end. 1 year after the memorial's dedication, Mrs. Nguyen Peterson sat on Frank's bench beside her brother's grave, reading from one of Frank's journals to Tommy, as Frank had done for 55 years. "Your American father kept his promise, Tommy," she said in Vietnamese, then repeated in English for the small group of visitors who had gathered. "He made sure you were never forgotten. He made sure your story was told." She placed 2 white roses on the grave, one from herself and one from Frank's memory. The tradition continued the promise kept and the love that had sustained Frank through decades of solitary vigil, now shared by an entire community. In the distance, Danny Martinez approached with his medical school acceptance letter, ready to share the good news with Tommy and Frank, continuing the conversation that had begun in a Vietnamese bunker 60 years earlier and would continue for generations to come. He kept a promise for 55 years, and in the end, the whole world learned why.